So let's say you've watched our Nymphing series and you're starting to put things together and you're connecting with fish fairly consistently, and then it happens. You connect with the monster fish you've been dreaming about for years. The panic sets in, your heart's beating 100 miles an hour. What do you do now? So today's video is going to be learning how to fight and land big fish. First of all, we want to be able to get that fish to net. And second of all, we want to be able to fight that fish effectively so we land it quickly and keep it healthy while it's in our care, and so it can return to the river nice and strong. These big fish have been living in the river a long time. They deserve our respect, and so we want to make sure that we're putting it in the best situation possible to be able to release it healthy. Now, I learned how to fight big fish mostly from salmon and steelhead fishing. When those things are ripping up and downstream, you learn a lot about what you can and can't do to be able to land fish. But it's not just applicable to salmon and steelhead. It's applicable to any river and any trout species or any fish that you're trying to control in those types of situations. So the first thing I'll say is how you fight that fish has a lot to do with the setup that you have. So let's go through a little bit about setups. So the first thing is that your rod and reel setup, they make a difference as to how you're going to be able to fight that fish. So if you have a longer rod that's a little bit softer, it's what we call slower action. So like a Nymphing rod is slower action. It's going to protect your tippet better than a rod that is a fast action rod. A fast action rod stays stiff throughout the length of the rod and just has the tip of it flex, whereas a softer action rod will bend all the way down through the rod, at least halfway down into the rod, sometimes further. So that softer rod is going to protect your tippet, and it's going to allow you to be able to do things with a fish that you might not be able to do on a faster action rod. The next is the strength of your tippet. So in combination with your rod, the strength of the tippet is going to determine how much pressure you can be able to put on that fish before you put yourself into a situation where it's potentially going to break. Obviously, the heavier line that you have, the more pressure you're going to be able to put on the fish, and the lighter line that you have, the less pressure you're going to be able to put on the fish. And you may choose the size of your tippets, the weight of your tippet, based on the situations that you're in. So I would really recommend learning the limitations of your setup. And a lot of times you're going to learn that when you get put in a tough situation, when you have a big fish, he's trying to run you into a root ball or something like that. You're going to have to keep him out, and you're going to learn limitations when you get to that point. Ideally, we'd like to understand those limitations before we get to the point where a big fish is trying to bury us in a root ball. So I would say next time you're in the river, snag up on something. Next time you're snagged up on something, test the limit of your rod. Put some bend in the rod. See how much pressure you can really put on it before that line breaks. So you want to fight it like you're fighting a fish and really see how much pressure you can put on it. A lot of times you're going to be able to put more pressure on that fish than you think you can, especially if you have a Nymphing rod or a slow action rod that's going to allow that bend to absorb a lot of the pressure. The next thing is situational awareness. So you're getting into a nice spot, a good spot that's potentially going to hold a big fish. Before you hook that fish, you should be planning. Always be analyzing, always be planning. I'm constantly doing this when I'm on the river. If I see a really good spot, I think there's going to be a big fish, I am planning, if I hook a big fish, what am I going to do? Am I going to be able to follow that fish down the side of the river? Am I not going to be able to follow that fish down the side of the river? What kind of obstacles do I have that I need to have that fish avoid? Start planning how you're going to fight that fish and where you're going to try to take that fish, or what things might be problematic before you go and hook that fish. That way, when you do hook a fish, you're going to have a game plan and you're going to be ready to roll. All right, so before we talk about fighting and landing the fish, let's talk about getting the optimized drift that's going to put us in the position to be able to hook that fish effectively. Okay. Ideally, I'm casting above me. I'm not casting quartering across and letting it come down. I'm usually casting significantly upstream, and I'm trying to get in contact with my flies pretty quickly. I do that because I want to be able to hook fish that are upstream of me. Okay, that way when I set the hook, I'm going to have a much better angle on the hook set where I'm going to be able to bury that hook in the fish's mouth. So I'm going to cast upstream, connect with the flies quickly through managing your line. I'm going to follow that drift all the way down in front of me, all the way down through, and then I'm going to let it drift a little bit below me. But once I get to about a rod length below me, I'm going to set the hook and I'm going to go right into my next cast. Okay. I don't really want to let it go down more than a rod length below me, because if I do, if I set the hook, I'm getting a bad angle on that hook set. So I'm pulling the fly upstream and away from the fish, which means I'm likely to pull that fly out of the fish's mouth. I'm likely to roll that fish. I'm likely to not get as deep of a hook on that fish as if I were to hook that fish upstream of me and pull downstream. I'm always gonna get a better hook set that way than if I'm below me and trying to set the hook. It's just a much better angle to be able to get a solid hook up on a fish, okay? Now, when I set the hook, I also want to be careful in the way that I'm setting the hook. I'm gonna let it drift down below me. Let's say I get a take. I'm gonna set that hook low and downstream, okay? And so let's say this is about what it looks like. I'm gonna set it hook low and downstream. It's just a snap of the wrist, a snap of the wrist. I would say if you have a really slow action rod, you might need to give it a little bit more to make sure you get a good hook set. The closer you are, the less you need to move it. The further away you are, the more you need to move it. But ideally, low into the downstream side is gonna be your hook set. It's gonna be your best angle of getting a good hookup. Okay, so fighting big fish is all about leverage and who's gonna have the advantage. Is it gonna be you or is it gonna be the fish? Okay, and rod angles and direction of rod is gonna make a huge difference as to who's gonna control who during that fight. So the first thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna set the hook low into the downstream side. I ideally wanna keep that fish at the same level or above upstream from me when I'm fighting it. I really don't want it to get downstream of me because generally it's gonna get a little more advantage by getting downstream of me, okay? So I wanna keep that fish either even with me or upstream. So as soon as I set the hook, I'm low and downstream, I'm gonna switch to the upstream side. I'm gonna switch to the upstream side, I'm gonna keep a nice deep bend in that rod, and I'm gonna be basically trying to pull that fish upstream, okay? What happens when you're pulling the fish upstream? That fish is pointing directly into the current, right? Fish are made to go directly into the current. They're much smaller and very aerodynamic, water dynamic, whatever you call it, to be able to go through the water forward. As soon as that fish turns broadside, you have lost the advantage. So keep that fish pointing upstream by keeping your rod to the upstream side and keeping it low and keeping a nice deep bend in that rod. So I'm gonna set the hook on the downstream side. I'm gonna immediately go to the upstream side and try to work that fish up toward me. One of the things that gives the fish leverage is fast water. So as soon as I hook that fish and I'm fighting him to the upstream side, I'm starting to look around and saying, okay, where is my fast water? Where's my slow water? I want to get that fish out of the fast water and into the slower water where he has less power against me. Okay, so look at the area that you're in, plan that out, understand where that water is. If you're further out into the middle of the river where it's fast, start backing up and trying to get into slower water. That slower water is going to make it a lot easier for you to fight, control, and land that fish. So I mentioned how important the rod angles and direction of the rod is, and it is super important, okay? So I'm gonna be trying to fight that fish with my rod low into the upstream side, keeping a nice deep bend in that rod. If that fish tries to go downstream, what am I gonna do to be able to turn him? So the first thing is, I'm gonna try to turn that fish, okay? What am I gonna be able to do to turn him? I'm gonna go low and hard to the upstream side, and I'm gonna try to get that fish. If that fish is heading down, I'm gonna try to turn him around. Again, if you get that fish's head coming around toward the upstream side, he's naturally gonna straighten out into the current and you're gonna gain more control that way, okay? So the fish runs down, low, and to the upstream side is gonna be the best way to try to control that fish. All right, let's say we get that fish turned around, he's now pointing upstream. I'm gonna keep my rod low into the upstream side. I'm gonna fight him with a nice deep bend in my rod, and I'm gonna try to pull him back upstream, back to either ahead of me or just above me, so I can be able to be in a better position to land that fish. One of the common mistakes I see is when a fish is going downstream, somebody will put their rod to the downstream side and pull to the side like this, okay? What that's gonna do is it's gonna give you an angle that's gonna turn that fish broadside in the current. When you turn that fish broadside in the current, that fish catches a lot of water and he's gonna have a huge advantage. That fish is gonna feel 10, 15 times heavier when you get him broadside than if you were to keep your rod upstream and low. The upstream and low is gonna point him upstream. Downstream and low is going to turn him broadside and make him way heavier, giving that fish a huge advantage over you. So if the fish is running down, do not go downstream side and low. Go upstream side and low. Get that fish pointing upstream is critical. So now let's say that fish ran across the river a little bit on me and I need to get him back across. I'm going to be fighting him with my upstream, with the rod upstream and low. But if I need to be able to move him back across this way, a lot of times the upstream and low is not going to get him to move across. That is a situation in which I will switch my rod to the downstream side and low to get that fish's head coming back across the current. And you just want to be really careful that you get him to come this way, but you don't give him enough room that he can turn around and go downstream. If he turns around and goes downstream, immediately switch back to the upstream side and get that angle coming back up the river, okay? But you can go downstream and low to get that fish come across. I don't usually leave it that way very long. It's just to get the fish moving in the direction toward me, and then I bring it back and try to pull him in this way. All right, so if you're this usually only happens if I'm salmon or steelhead fishing, and usually salmon, but you get these monster 25-pound fish, and those migratory fish, man, they are thinking about one thing, going upstream and spawning. So a lot of times you hook a big salmon or a big steelhead, and instead of going downstream, they want to go upstream, which is better. You'd rather have them go upstream against the current than have the current with them going downstream, okay? But if they go upstream, what I generally recommend, in this case, I keep my rod low again and to the bank side of the upstream side. And what that's going to do is if I can turn their head a little bit, I can get them to run a little bit further toward the side of the river. Generally into slower water, generally into shallower water, both of which makes that fish lose leverage. Now it doesn't work if it's deep and fast on the right side, or on the upstream side, toward the bank. But in general, I want to try to work them toward slower, shallower water. They're going to lose their leverage. Generally speaking, that's going to be with your rod to the upstream side and toward the bank is going to be able to pull them over that way. Okay, so let's say you have a running fish that you can't turn around, right? It's going to happen a lot of times probably, but if you've got a fish that's running and you can't stop it by trying to turn it around, you're going to have to go follow that fish. Number one thing, when that happens and the fish is running and you can't stop it, rod high in the air. What I want to make sure I do is I want to make sure that I avoid my line from catching any debris, rocks, whatever in the water as that fish is running. He's going to be going past a lot of stuff. If you keep your rod low while that fish is running and you can't stop him, he's going to hang you around a rock or a tree or something. Put that rod high. Don't put pressure on that fish when he's running. Generally, they're running from the pressure that you're putting on them. So if they're running, I put the rod high, I take the pressure off the fish, and I start following them wherever they're going, okay? Generally, if they don't feel the pressure, they typically tend to stop swimming downstream or swimming upstream, and they might bury themselves in an eddy or in a slow area. Leave the pressure off that fish. Now, I'm not saying give it slack. I'm not saying give it slack. You want to keep a bend in the rod, but you don't want to put a lot of pressure on that fish, because when that fish is stopped and they're in a little place, keep enough pressure that you're going to keep him hooked, but not enough pressure that he knows that he's hooked to where he's going to try to run again. So just put a light pressure on that fish, and that's your opportunity to go follow and catch up to that fish as he's trying to rest in an eddy or a different piece of water. As soon as you put pressure on that fish again, it's likely to go berserk again and take off. Really great time to catch up to that fish is when they stop in an eddy. When that fish gets farther away from you, the fish immediately has the advantage. You have the advantage when you're closer to the fish. The fish has the advantage when he puts distance between you and him, right? A couple of the reasons are you have less control at distance. You don't have the ability to move that fish and control that fish doing what you need to. The angles are different. And if you've got fly line that's now in the water, that water is pressing against the fly line. It actually puts an immense amount of pressure on that fish, which oftentimes will break your line. And that's why I say keep your rod high, keep the line out of it. If you're using something like a mono rigs, or even the Nymphing fly lines, they cut through the water so much better than a weight forward fly line. A weight forward fly line is gonna catch so much water when that fish goes down or upstream, and it's gonna put an immense amount of pressure on that fish. The thinner you can go on your main lines, the more it's gonna cut through the water, and you're gonna have a better direct connection to those fish. All right, so let's say you've gotten that fish under control and it's time to start thinking about netting that fish. I see so many people make so many really bad mistakes when they are trying to either net the fish themselves, or especially when they're trying to net somebody else's fish, okay? Number one, don't rush, okay? Stay calm, wait for the right moment to be able to net that fish. Number two, do not be taking the net and stabbing at a fish, okay? That is not ready to come in. I'm gonna tell you guys how to be able to land a fish, but I'm gonna tell you right now, the worst thing you can do is take a net and stab at a fish and miss it, okay? What I often see, and this is usually salmon and steelhead fishing, is somebody's up above, they're trying to net a fish that's down below that fisherman, and they've waded out into deeper water, and they're right behind the fish, and they're trying to scoop and come up with that fish. That's usually a recipe for disaster, man. Number one, don't try to net the fish in deep water like that. The fish is gonna have the advantage. He's gonna be able to get away from you. It's gonna take you too much time to get that net up and to be able to get him in there. He's likely to turn around and get caught in your feet because you're in the deep water right behind him. Just stay out of that zone, man. Stay out of that zone, okay? Work that fish up into shallower water if at all possible, and wait for the opportune moment to get that fish. All right, now there are two ways to land a fish. Number one is when you have a net man, like you got a buddy with you who's gonna help you net that fish, okay? The second is when you're by yourself and how you're gonna be able to net that fish when you're alone. So let's take it from the standpoint of you've got a fishing buddy who's gonna help you net that fish. First thing, when there's two people involved, somebody has to be in charge and there has to be constant communication. As an experienced fisherman, I am constantly telling that person, my net man, what to do or what not to do. I'm constantly communicating. I see them starting to go for it and the fish isn't ready. I'm going, no, 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 not yet, not yet. And I tell them what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna get that fish up and I'm gonna lift his head and I'm gonna surf him right to you. All you should have to do is lift your net up when I get that fish close to the net, right? I'm in that kind of communication. If you've got a rookie fisherman and a more experienced net man, then I would say the net man should be helping that rookie fisherman on what to do to be able to net that fish. But ideally, first thing we're gonna do, get to slower, get to shallower water, okay? I'm gonna keep the rod low and to the upstream side, keeping that fish right around in front of me, all right? I'm gonna have the net man below me and just a little bit out, not much. And then I'm gonna tire that fish out. I'm gonna lift that fish's head up and I'm gonna turn my rod to this side and I'm gonna try to surf that fish right to my partner and right to his net, so that all he should have to do is go like this when the fish comes to him. So the key is, I need to get that fish's head up and I need to get him off on his side, okay? I don't wanna just lift up and have that fish still, upright. I wanna get that fish up and I wanna get his head turned over. I wanna get him on his side where he doesn't have his leverage, and now I can basically just surf him over to my net man. All right, now if you're the net man for somebody else, there's nothing worse than losing somebody else's fish. You have to stay patient. You have to wait until the right moment to be able to net that fish. Like I said before, don't go wading off into deep water to try to find that fish and to scoop him up. Don't stab at that fish, okay? That angler has to be in control of that fish and bring that fish to you, and then you literally just be patient and just literally, you should be able to just scoop that fish as he's surfed right at you, okay? Now, I do have a couple of situations where I had a net man with me, and my net man, number one, I communicated to him, but number two, he's a very experienced net man, and he didn't make stupid moves, right? One of the other things is having the right amount of line out to be able to get that fish surfed over to your partner, especially when it's a big fish, makes all the difference in the world. If you have too much line out, that fish isn't gonna come far enough, and you're gonna lose the leverage. He's gonna put his nose back down, and he's gonna go out. If you have too little line, it's gonna want to lift that fish out of the water or put too much bend in the rod. So getting the right amount of line out really makes a difference. Actually, Devin Olson just released a video on learning to get the right amount of line out. I suggest you check that one out as well when you're landing fish. I'll leave that one down in the description as well. Now, I do have a couple of videos from last year where I accidentally had too much line out, and I go to bring that fish in, and he's not quite getting there, and he gets his nose back down and he takes back off. Number one, my mistake. I had too much line out and I didn't bring that fish in appropriately. Number two, my net man did not try to get too aggressive and net that fish. He held off. He waited till I got the right amount of line out to be able to net that fish appropriately. If he had gone after that fish and tried to scoop him, there's a chance he could have lost that fish. My net man was very responsible. He waited till the right moment when I had the right amount of line out. We worked together and we were able to land a fish effectively. Now, let's say you're on your own and you're gonna net a big fish on your own. This is a lot harder to do, okay? Number one, I don't like beaching fish. It puts them on the rocks where they're gonna smash their head on the rocks, give them a head injury. They're more likely to die that way. I highly recommend, I use a short-handled large hoop net when I Euro nymph, and that's gonna be the best way to be able to control the net and control the fish at the same time. If you use a net with a long handle, it's really hard for one person to use. But I use a net, it's attached to my back, it's got a very short handle but a very big hoop, and I can grab it whenever I'm ready, and it allows me to be able to control very easily, okay? So as I'm fighting that fish, and I'm gonna try to net him myself, I cannot do that when the fish is below me. You're gonna lift your rod, you're gonna try to bring the fish up to you, and it's gonna bend your rod too much. That fish is never gonna come to you enough to be able to net it if you try to net the fish when he's downstream of you, okay? Rod low into the upstream side. You're gonna work that fish up above you, okay? When you get the fish up above you and you get him to a point where he's tired, you're gonna lift and you're gonna turn him on his side, and when you get him on his side, you're gonna use the current to float that fish back to you. You're gonna have the net out, he's gonna float right back to the net. You can take one step forward and scoop that fish. You don't even need to take a step forward a lot of times. You just lean and scoop that fish. Okay, you're gonna use the current to your advantage. Get that fish up ahead of you, get their head lifted and to the side. They're gonna float back to you, and you just keep tension on the fish as you come back, and then slide the net under and lift, okay? It sounds really hard sometimes, but when you get the right amount of line out, you get the fish in the right position, it's actually not as hard as it might seem. All right, you've netted that fish, you've won the battle, you're so excited, but now you have a responsibility, okay? Now that you've landed that fish again has lived in the river a long time, and I want it to live in the river as long as it possibly can. Now that I've netted that fish, I have a responsibility to make sure I take care of that fish effectively and get him back in the river nice and healthy, okay? So the number one thing I'm gonna do, I'm gonna keep that fish in the water in the net, right? Now imagine you just ran, I say this all the time, you ran a half marathon or whatever, you're exhausted, you cross the finish line and somebody jams your head in a bucket of water, right? It's very dangerous to do that. The fish needs to be able to recover, okay? He needs to be able to breathe. Once you net that fish, don't lift him up and be parading him around to all your friends and walking around. No. Once you net that fish right in the water, right? I don't even lift the fish out of the water most of the time when I net them. I net the fish and I leave the fish right in the water. I'm gonna get to a safe place where I can put my rod down and where I can sit down with that fish, but I'm gonna keep that fish in the water for at least a little while to make sure that it's gonna recover and that I'm not taking its oxygen away. Okay, if you want a picture of this fish, which I'm assuming you're probably gonna want to, we're gonna leave it in the net, leave it in the water until we're ready to take a picture, okay? When we go to take the picture, this is a big fish. We're gonna use two hands to be able to control this fish, okay? Number one, I'm not gonna stand up. I'm gonna squat down with that fish. I'm gonna get right down into the water with that fish. I do not want to lift that fish more than a foot or so above the water, okay? If I do that, if I lift the fish up here and that fish flops, which they're gonna do, and they drops on a rock or whatever, you're gonna kill that fish. Never keep a fish up high like that. Get right down low to the water with that fish, okay? If you've got somebody helping you take a picture, tell that person to get down to fish level, okay? You ever notice how when everybody takes a selfie to make themselves look skinnier, they put the phone up here and they do it, right? So by putting a phone up high and looking down, it's gonna make everything look smaller, okay? By getting down to the level of the fish and taking a picture down low at the same level of the fish, it's going to give a better picture and a better representation of what that fish looks like. It's going to appear bigger because it's going to appear the size it really is, okay? You have your cameraman get down low with you. You're down low next to the water. You're going to put one hand around the tail and you're going to put the other one just ahead of the belly but behind the head. You're going to support that fish. You're going to lift them up no more than a foot off the water. Your buddy's going to get some pictures. If you want to make sure that you get a full picture of the entire length, instead of putting your hand around like this, you can put your hand behind the fish so you can make sure you get the full tail in the picture. And by doing that, you're going to get a nice, beautiful picture of that fish. You're not going to put that fish at risk by holding it too high above the water. And as soon as that picture's done, you can lower that fish right back down into the net where he's safe. Once you have your picture, you keep that fish in the net. You're getting ready to release that fish. Basically the same hand hold. I'm going to put one hand around the tail. I'm going to support the fish underneath with the other hand. I'm going to get him out of the net, back into the water. I'm going to hold that fish there, and I'm not going to shove him off and be like, all right, thank you, buddy. No, I'm going to hold that fish, and when he's ready, he's going to kick, right? We should see a nice strong kick. That fish is going to kick out of our hand and back into the river nice and healthy. All right, well, I hope you guys found this video helpful and you feel like the next time you connect with a monster fish that you're gonna have the confidence that you can get it to net effectively. Steelhead season is basically upon us, so if you guys are interested in steelhead fishing, check out the Euro Nymphing for Steelhead series I did and a couple of adventure videos. I'll link some stuff down below for you guys. It's really fantastic, big fish fishing that's so much freaking fun. And I also want to give a shout out to our White Dog Pack members. Thank you guys so much for supporting the channel and everything that we do. And hey, it's a beautiful fall. The fish are starting to come in the rivers. It's a great time to get out fishing. So good luck to everybody out there, and we'll see you all soon.